Fortunately, we then got another question from Christopher Chesham, exactly on Edmund Burke, and very much addressing some of these questions. Here, Christopher's question is, Edmund Burke was a member of the Whig Party. Yet he is often considered to be the founding father of conservatism. Do you agree with this view? Well, I can give you a short answer or a long answer. I'll do both. The short answer is yes, he is the founding father of conservatism. Indeed, I would argue he's the only person who has come up with a view of conservatism that can possibly survive in the modern world. Now, it's very important, again, that we talk sensibly about Burke. Burke is frequently referred to as a political philosopher. I think that's a very misleading term. Burke writes no formal theoretical work. He makes speeches, extraordinary speeches, he writes essays, he intervenes in lawsuits, and finally he writes the extraordinary reflections on the revolution in France, right at the beginning of the revolution, after there's been the march on Versailles and the royal family has been seized. You've actually murdered their bodyguards, and the royal family have been captured by the Parisian mob and taken forcibly to Paris from Versailles, and the court of Versailles broken up. But it's on the very eve of the infinite radicalism of the revolution. There's yet no reign of terror, there's no Napoleon, there are no revolutionary wars, but in that extraordinary work, in the Reflections, Burke foresees them all. So Burke really, how would I describe him? He's a very great pamphleteer. It's also very striking how inconsistent he is, how much his opinions shift. And this, again, clearly somebody who is a Whig and becomes the founding father of modern conservatism. Most of Burke's career had been directed against royal power, untrammelled royal power. He thought that the power of George III and George III's appetite to exercise direct personal monarchical authority was profoundly dangerous. If you remember, again, I'm sorry to be so referential, self-referential, but I am trying to, in all of these, in all of the things that I'm doing on David Starkey Talks, I'm trying to develop, I suppose, a single body of ideas. To call it my philosophy is subject to precisely the same critique that I've just made of Edmund Burke. I haven't written a coherent body of thought, but I am very aware of Burke being on one very forcible side. Burke, of course, is a monarchist, but he is a believer, if you remember. I distinguish the two different types of monarchy. Burke is a passionate believer in monarchy as monarchy under the law, as the representative of the broader spirit of the nation. He is very hostile to the individual monarch. That's the other view of royal authority, which is personal and not symbolic, which is the actual will of the monarch being the prime driver of politics. He sees that as dangerous, and he sees it in George III's case as being brought about by illegitimate means of patronage and all the rest of it. And again, very interestingly, Burke sets himself forward as a major opponent of the system of patronage, which of course I've just argued when I was answering Terence's question, is an absolutely central part, however dirty and slightly soiling it may be, of keeping a parliamentary assembly under control. But of course, it's done, and this is the magic of the British parliamentary system, it's done not to fulfil the wishes of an individual sovereign, and at least not an individual monarch, king or queen. It's done for the temporary monarch, as I distinguished before, the fact that the Premier is really a second king, and the magic of the formula which the founder of the office of Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, came up with was that, first of all, the office of Prime Minister controls the monarch, so as the monarch fulfills the broad thrust of whatever the majority elected in the House of Commons wants. That's That's one side. In other words, it is a device which pressures the monarchy to follow the broad outline of policy as endorsed by the political nation by its elections of MPs to Parliament. That's one side of the office of Prime Minister. But the Prime Minister's office is Janus-faced. It uses those powers of royal patronage, which are given over entirely now to the Prime Minister, to manage Parliament back. So it both is the Parliament's device for managing the monarchy, and it's the monarchy, now subcontracted to the Prime Minister's, device for managing Parliament. That's how it works, this extraordinary double process that holds the thing together, which is both so subtle, so strong when it's done properly, and so fragile as at the moment. And you see this double side of the thing so clearly in the mere 2 years of Boris's premiership, as he's gone from the strong bonding of these two things to the beginning of their fragmentation, maybe their inevitable dissolution. Right. So we then got Burke's, the strange twists and turns of Burke's career, as I said, passionately opposed to direct exercise of royal power, and yet that's the Whig position, the holding of the monarch to account, the elevation of the authority of Parliament, and yet what? Turning pretty much on a pin's head after 1789 with the beginning of the French Revolution. Because what I think is the extraordinary quality, Christopher, of Burke's thought is that it's responsive to events. This is why it changes. In other words, Burke is a creature of circumstance. He is, again, let's quote another supreme thinker, and a thinker who does indeed formulate his opinions in a much more formal fashion than Burke ever did, J.M. Keynes. The famous remark of Keynes, when the circumstances change, I change my mind, don't you? There is no thinker who is a clearer and more brilliant example of doing this than Burke. So his thought, and his thought on politics, and his conservative thought in particular, isn't a series of tightly argued logical propositions or principles such as we get in classical political thought, in the great Greek theorists and so on. Instead, it's a series of insights. It's a series of observations. It's a series of similes. It's a series of brilliant phrases and ideas tossed off in the heat of the moment. In other words, this again I think is very important. Burke is supremely inductive. He's responding actually to events. He's not got great general principles. He's responding to events. He's arguing up. And Burke, again, is extraordinarily particular. What is striking, of course, is Burke has no belief in, general political systems. He never addresses such ideas. I think he would have regarded them as absurd. What Burke does instead is talk about actual political systems, the political system of England, which he knew so well, and what he sees from 1789 as the catastrophic changes which are being driven through by the ignorance and the passion of revolutionary mob politics in France. And that is the great moment of change. Of course, what he does in that is to enunciate, although they're done very briefly, he does enunciate certain points of absolutely general relevance. What does he see? Why does Burke spot so quickly what's happening in France and what the direction of travel is, and why does he anticipate Napoleon, the Revolutionary Wars, the Terror and the lot, even though all of those processes are just at the very beginning? What he grasps very quickly, and by the way, an awful lot of the reflections on the revolution in France, he deeply, deeply boring. Let's be truthful. It's an analysis of the redrawing of French political geography and so on in the most minute detail. It's a discussion of the creation of a new currency, or method of national debt, which is known as the assignat, a paper currency based on the confiscated assets to begin with of the church, and then of course everything else that the French revolutionary state lays its hands upon. But in and amidst, it's not dross, but it's pretty heavy going, and it's highly specific. It's occasional, it's a response to those facts. There are these nuggets, they're more than nuggets, they're crown jewels, they're diamonds of observation and shrewdness, and they're driven by, I think, two dominant principles. The first is the notion that, and it's put in a very, very well-known phrase. When he's talking about contract theory, the French claim, the French revolutionaries claim that indeed aspects of the Whig Party in England talk about the idea of the social contract, that we are individuals and we enter in, it's an idea of justifying individual rights. The idea is that the state is composed of individuals who enter into a notional agreement in return for the preservation of their inherent rights to set up the machinery of the state in what's called the social contract. Burke is clearly very sceptical, and rightly sceptical, of this notion, and he puts his scepticism again into one of these extraordinarily brief, perceptive sentences which say, and I'm not quoting as precisely as I should, that if indeed there is a social contract, it is a contract not simply between all those of us now, it is a contract between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. In other words, that the state is something that exists not simply now, but across time. That also has absolutely fundamental consequences for the relationship of the individual to the state. The state is prior to the individual. Society is prior to the individual. The whole notion, which is seen most clearly in the thinker who is the absolute antithesis to Burke, that's to say Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In Rousseau, the idea is that of unconstrained human freedom. You will remember the extraordinary opening of the Contrat Social, which is man is born free, yet everywhere is in chains. I've already talked about this a little. He's not born free. Girls aren't born free. Boys aren't born free. We're all born, the wonderful phrase of St. Augustine, amidst, I will use it, urine and feces. We're weak, we're feeble, we can't survive for a moment. We need washing, we need feeding, and we do it for months and months and months. We are dependent. We are the least able of creatures after our birth to fend for ourselves. We are the ones most dependent on society, and this has profound consequences, and it's in this that fundamentally the idea of conservatism is rooted, that we are products of our time and our circumstance and the locality. We are English. Those of us who are born in England are English. Those of us who are born in France are France. And you're born into radically different social traditions, traditions of language, traditions of culture, and so on. And those things are what make us. In other words, there is no universal, as the French Revolution thought, there is no universal model of man to which all particular local organisations should aspire. And it's this particularity, as opposed to the universalism of the French, that is the basis of, I think, Burke's genius. Because, of course, what Burke sees is the French Revolution's attempt at bringing the reality of France, the actual inherited reality of France, into line with the supposed universal types, the idea that you can simply remake society in accordance with general principles. He sees that as the beginning of the catastrophe, which is why he spends so much time scoffing, and scoffing correctly, at the whole decimalised obsession of France. I mean, we have the metric system. It is, of course, completely useless for most individual practical purposes. The millimetre is too small. The litre is too big. The kilo is too heavy. The inch and the pound and the yard and the foot work extraordinarily well. But of course, they're not logical. They don't go to 10, base 10. But remember, the absurdities of the French reworking of the world in accordance with logic went much further than that. They wanted a decimal calendar. They wanted a decimal clock. And they put all of those into practice. You had 10 days in the week. You had 10 months in the year. You had 10 hours in the day. And of course, it don't work. And trying to make it work, trying to force that through, trying to force that ruthless systematization through, destroys and destroys and destroys, and puts nothing of value in its place. That is Burke's great point. He anticipates that. But of course, he does something else, which is bearing in mind the fact that he'd been a Whig, which is the direct ancestor of liberalism. What he's really saying is that liberalism itself, the idea of the primacy of the individual will, and its, as it were, its untrammeled right to express itself, that is the seed of infinite danger, because there's no reason for it ever to stop. That is the danger, and that is the great division between the liberal thinker and the conservative thinker, and that is Burke. And of course, there is the wonderful language of Burke, those great similes of the British people as a kind of contented cows browsing away, chewing the cud beneath the spreading British oak, whilst noisy grasshoppers around the proponents of revolutionary thought try to distract them. And actually, that's turned out not to be too bad, really, for most of British politics. But ironically, it was exactly the broadening of the electorate, as somebody else that I shall be talking about a great deal in the not too distant future, Disraeli. It was the Conservatives who broadened the electorate at decisive points in 1867 and ushered in the general tendency of British and more particularly English politics towards a version of Burkean conservatism. So yes, Christopher, I do think that Burke is this supreme political thinker, but as I said, in a very particular way, and the father of conservatism, but in this remarkable way. It's brought about by the collision of events. It's episodic, it's reactive, it's a series of highly particular observations. It's supremely inductive. I'm afraid the miscellany, I think, is only going to have 2 bits. We're going to have a second modern miscellany, but I do hope you've enjoyed my attempt at, in fact, again, teasing round the idea of Burke, the one Burke, the Burke of Bristol, the one that I very much disagree with, still very firmly of Whiggish tendencies, and the second Burke, the Burke of the Reflections on the Revolution in France, as I said, is the supreme conservative thinker, and the only one, I think, that offers us a purchase for some kind of continuing conservatism now, which addresses the idea of a national tradition, a particular way of doing things, and that we should actually stick with that way of doing things. And what I will do when I pick up the the next of my Q&As, I will actually begin with that idea of a national tradition, a national way of doing things, because that is the way in which Disraeli, in 100 years after Burke, Disraeli addressed the very interesting question, and I'm moving on to another thought, but it's worth doing it to lay the foundation of what I'm going to say next. Disraeli, 100 years after Burke, addresses, can there actually be a conservatism in a modern progressive society like Victorian England? This is a great speech in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. And Disraeli says, well, we are a progressive society. We are a society that changes, and that, of course, has simply been yet more true with every decade that has come after Disraeli. We are a society that changes. He says, therefore, how can you have conservatism at all? He says, there are two ways of handling change. One is the French revolutionary way, which is the one that's excoriated by Burke, in which you do it according to general and universal principles. The other, he says, is the conservative way, which is to do it within an existing national tradition. And this seems to me to be the right thing to do. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.